Tonight's event is part of a series of artist talks made possible through the FEP grant from Broward College Student Life. Our speaker tonight is Kretz. Kate's workshop tomorrow is titled Digging Deep, Finding Your Visual Voice. The workshop is geared toward visual artists and will involve intuitive and strategic exercises to develop and focus your visual vocabulary. You will find brochures in the room for, if you want to save the dates for the rest of the speakers in the series. There's still 2 more this semester, Taylor and Amy. Amy's actually here tonight. There's also surveys on your seats. If you have time before you leave, please fill out a survey because that will help us with the grant process and hear your feedback for future talks. Kate Kretz grew up in upstate New York and spent several years living abroad in France. She earned a certificate at the Sorbonne and a BFA at the State University of New York at Binghamton before receiving her MFA from the University of Georgia. Kate's work has appeared in over 95 international newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, Art Papers, Surface Design, and Vanity Fair Italy. She has exhibited internationally and at important museums, and her controversial painting, Blessed Art Thou, appeared in hundreds of international news sources and continues to be published in university textbooks worldwide. She has received the North Carolina Arts Council Grant, the South Florida Cultural Consortium Fellowship, the Florida Visual Arts Fellowship, a Malay Colony Residency, and is a 2013 Trewick Prize finalist. After working as an associate professor and BFA director at FIU for 10 years, she relocated to Washington, D.C. Kate's art making crosses media boundaries, creating obsessively made objects that tell difficult truths. Her work reveals aspects of ourselves that we normally try to conceal and poses questions about the absurd nature of the world we live in. Please join me in welcoming Kate Kretz.
I want to thank Lisa Rockford for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here back in South Florida and to see some familiar faces. In many ways, I've relocated a couple of times since I moved out of the area, so in many ways, this is still my art community more than any other art community, and I come back for Basel every year. Thanks to all of you for making the effort to be here. Please forgive my reading. I am going to read because I don't want to miss anything. And all of the pieces I'm going to show you today are all labeled so that I don't have to spend any time telling you what they're made of. I'm not being melodramatic when I say that art has saved my life. I feel quite certain that if I didn't make things, I would display a less healthy compulsive behavior, another more debilitating addiction, or would simply not be here at all. I was born into an often magical but deeply dysfunctional family. If you know anything about alcoholism, you know how those two things can exist together. And I was raised on a visual regimen of Catholicism and Technicolor movies. Both of these inspirations employ lurid colors, dramatic light, and a highly defined code of morality. Most significantly, both contain an air of repression that is almost palpable, and a tacit understanding that there are certain truths we dare not utter. I realized at an early age that every aspect of society seemed to have its own agenda and correlate secrets. My obsession with bringing truths to light has consumed my work from the very beginning. through decades of seemingly disparate subject matter and dramatic shifts in media. Trained as a painter, my earliest works were night landscapes. A lifelong insomniac, I used to climb out of my window at night, sneak out and wander around to drink in the night air. My undergraduate painting professors, as they have to do, were always telling me to loosen up. But in graduate school, my work just got tighter and tighter until I was painting each leaf on the trees, then the highlight and shadow on each leaf. Every work also included many layers of a traditional Renaissance oil glaze, and my techniques began to require 3 to 12 months of intense work until they matched the picture in my brain. Stopping short of that vision would be a compromise and was not an option. I've always believed that people are more real at night, that stripped of their daytime context, you can have a much deeper conversation with people at 2 a.m. than you can over coffee at 9. So I switched to making paintings of people at night, surrounded by obsessively detailed environments. This is a 6 by 6 foot painting that took me 9 months to do, 3 months for the pillows. And that's in grad school, so that's working round the clock. During the endless all-nighters that I pulled, there seemed to be an intuitive correlation between being up at 3 a.m. and the focused intensity of paint each stitch of a tapestry. Like a spider intently weaving a web and only steps back to see what she has done when the sun comes up. Paint as visually seductive as possible, but if you looked closer, there were elements that destroyed the illusion. A tilted picture plane, cheap paneling, a dress missing a belt, chewed off fingernail polish. Having grown up in a poor family, I was now thinking about class and attempts to transcend it. I was thinking about shame. I was thinking about those parts of our lives we try to control that do not always cooperate. I have several lifetimes worth of ideas, so in my practice, there has always been an uncanny aspect to figuring out what needs to be made next. The ideas, like spaghetti, are thrown against the wall, and the universe helps me to determine which one sticks. The development process always needs to begin with compelling visual imagery, include a challenge to do something that I've never done before, whether technically or conceptually, and then most importantly, the layers of meaning in a potential piece start to serendipitously reveal themselves to me and build upon one another. And then I know this is the work that needs to be made next. For example, in the Beauty Rest series, featuring women sleeping in cars, they're all in various states of consciousness. The idea began with a visual impetus, the way that light and shadows move across a figure in a car. But I had also been plagued for many years by nightmares in which I was driving a car and a man was trying to block my view with his coat or throw himself between me and the windshield. I thought about cars as metaphors for relationships. They can take you to exciting places, but they can also be claustrophobic. Then I began to meet woman after woman who literally gave away the keys to her own car under different circumstances, or was in some way or another a passenger in her own life. I wasn't looking for it, but all these stories just dropped at my feet. The thoughts and experiences came together like a train wreck, telling me that I had to make the paintings. I titled work in this series after real articles in Cosmopolitan magazine, a publication devoted to teaching women how to appear independent while trying to snag a husband. This one's titled, How to Tell If He's Lying to You, page 42. At this point, a gallery offered to show the Beauty Rest series if I would continue to paint women sleeping in cars, but I was already on to the next thing. The Vigil series marked an emotional breakdown after a series of personal losses. I focused on the bereft feeling one gets following the realization that the rest of the world was not playing by the same Catholic Technicolor rules. I moved on to straightforward self-portraits. I didn't want to hide behind a constructed narrative any longer. I was interested in practicing radical vulnerability as a defiant act. This piece, entitled Promise, is a crying self-portrait executed in charcoal. The parts of the face that swell up when one cries are emphasized through color, and a vigil candle is caught in the clavicle area, suspended in the short gasps of breath experienced during a hard cry. The candle was a theme running through the series as well, and many of the paintings featured a candle in some way, shape, or form as a reference to this vigil. Many of these works also featured an open mouth. I believe that showing one's hidden self to others was the most effective way to connect to other human beings and make them feel as though they were not alone. This series culminated in the 6 by 8 foot painting titled Fate of a Technicolor Romantic, which took a year of intense work to paint. It began as another self-portrait, heavy with familial shame and crammed with all the books and films that created my quixotic beliefs, the ones that were now so much in conflict with the outside world. The painting evolved into a war of light between the reality represented by a dim 40-watt light bulb and the blue light of idealism glowing from the Technicolor film on television. In all of my painting, light carries content, and it's as vital and concrete in my mind as any other element in the work. I took pilot lessons at one point, and because this painting is also about my dysfunctional family, the pilot's manual is open to emergency approach and landings because one constantly has to be prepared for the next crisis. On the TV is the gazebo scene from The Sound of Music. Old Milwaukee above it was my dad's beer of choice. So I got a grant and I went from one artist residency to another during the summer, working on this painting at each stop. I was at the Malay colony in upstate New York, talking to another older artist and telling him how emotionally draining this painting was to work on. Start something else, he said. Do what your hands want to do. So I whittled. Some Penises I Have Known embodies the feeling of vulnerability that comes upon the realization that you have made not one, but a host of bad choices. It borrows the style of American folk art, one of my loves, and depicts the idiosyncratic characteristics of each suitor. Many people accuse me of creating a man-bashing piece, but the common denominator to these bad choices was me. It was the first time I realized that a work could be an exorcism of sorts. Once they were embodied, the weight of these decisions left my consciousness. Sacred Ovaries depicts the conundrum of desiring a child, but knowing that you will, despite all your best intentions and many years of therapy, pass on some of the familial pathologies. I mapped the Sacred Heart, a Catholic symbol of devotional love, onto the ovaries, and filled the kitchen with symbols that embody these dangerous human frailties. The piece was shown at Agnes Scott College and consequently landed me on the annual Catholic anti-defamation list. I had a very nice email correspondence with Bill Donahue about this piece, and I explained to him that because it was a symbol of devotional love, it was perfect to explain that feeling of desiring a child and wanting to be a devoted mother, etc., and that I thought it was one of the most reverent pieces I'd ever made. And his response was, "That's what you artists always say." The open mouth was featured in the earlier self-portraits, now became disembodied at a certain point, appearing in the sanctum suite of small encaustic paintings. Here, the interior landscape is painted in wax on one layer, while the bas-relief mouth and teeth are on a cutout second level above. I see now that this was another attempt to go deeper and get beyond two-dimensional limits. My work often uses weather as a metaphor for the unpredictability and devastation of dysfunctional family relationships. Although I am a thrill seeker who is fascinated by tornadoes and would be first in line for a tornado watch vacation, I am also plagued by nightmares where several tornadoes are hovering on the horizon, a symbol of impending doom, catastrophes waiting to strike. I'm trying to capture the anxiety of waiting for a force of nature to descend upon you. You guys know a little bit about that here in South Florida, I think. The work is the result of a lifetime of familiar moments when the phone rings, another intense family drama is revealed, and I brace myself thinking, here we go again. Later, the open mouth appeared in a series of pillows embroidered with my own hair. I think of these embroideries as drawings. Note that the mark making on this first one is still quite crude, and they do get more intricate with each piece. Whenever I think I cannot possibly get more obsessive in my work, I find a way to go further. In My Young Lover, I use the hair of an ex-boyfriend, threading each hair individually through the pillowcase so it appears to grow out of the pillowcase, cascade around the embroidered ear and across the pillow. This was actually inspired in part by a Leonard Cohen song, I loved you in the morning, our kisses deep and warm, your hair across the pillow like a sleepy golden storm. Years ago, a boyfriend brought me his hair in a box, and he said, "I think you love my hair more than you love me." He had these long golden ringlets. He must have been right because he's not around anymore, but I kept the gorgeous hair on display in a glass box in my living room for several years. When I got engaged, I figured it would be a good time to make a piece out of it and get it out of the house. Ebb uses human eyelashes that actually protrude from the surface of the pillow. And these pillows were shown at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York as part of their Pricked Extreme Embroidery Show, which was really a thrill for me to be included in. I then moved on to fabric and doilies stretched under convex glass and Victorian frames to emphasize the relic-like nature of the pieces. Now by this time I'm using various shades of hair, and I actually begin to sort of semi-weave the threads to create the effects that I want. And here you can kind of see that. Each hair embroidery takes about 3 months to do. I feel it's an act of resistance in a world that moves as fast as ours does, and that the time invested is part of the gift given to the viewer. Now, 15 years ago, I never would have dreamed that sewing and embroidery would become a part of my work. I was a painting major, and I have no training in fiber whatsoever. At a certain point, though, working solely with illusional space began to feel inadequate to me. It was too distanced, and I wanted to go deeper. I wanted to get inside. So I thought about creating psychological states that one could wear. We normally use garments to construct an identity. a conscious choice of our own packaging to be revealed to the world, and I began to create clothes that reveal psychological states rather than concealing them, leaving us beyond naked, turning the insides out. And up to this point, my sewing experience was limited to pillows that I made for my couch. Long before upcycling became a thing, I like to decorate with objects that I have made or altered from thrift stores. I made this object for my living room. First it was as it appears on top, and then I decided it needed some padding, so I figured out how to make a kind of quilted, padded interior for it. And curators coming to my house to look at paintings would see objects like this, and they'd be like, oh, can we take this and put it in the show? So they convinced me to show them, and that led to pieces like this. The embroidery of veins on a padded satin surface was repeated again in this first garment, fertilization dress. This was a found dress, I'm not sewing them yet, with 2 layers of navy chiffon. I embellished both layers with sperm made of fake pearls and embroidered tails. They stop at the biologically correct spot, but one stray sperm, suggests that it is the heart that will be fertilized. Fertilization purse in blue velvet with red satin padded interior was made to match. I took a thrift store purse apart, making careful notes of how it was stitched together, used it as a pattern, and I made my own new one from scratch using the old frame. The entire piece is stitched by hand because I would have had no idea how to sew a purse on a sewing machine. Around this time, I was asked to participate in the Vagina Show at iDrum Gallery in Atlanta. The Penis, as I've known, piece was shown at the Penis Show at iDrum in Atlanta, and they said, hey, we're having a vagina show. Do you have any vaginas? And since I was doing the psychological clothing series, I seized upon the opportunity to create the archetypal vagina dentata purse, a functional clutch with a snap mechanism in hand-dyed red velvet and shaped red shells for teeth. And whenever I give talks, there are at schools, there's usually, if I don't explain it, some guy in the back of the room that says, how did you get the idea for the vagina dentata purse? And I have to explain to him that it's not my idea, and that it's been around for a very, very long time. Defense mechanism coat is made with 150 pounds of roofing nails pushed through the surface of a blue wool coat that I bought at the Red, White, and Blue in North Miami. Inside the coat, all the major veins and arteries of the body are embroidered. I wanted to make the interior look so tender that it would bleed if touched, so I quilted the flesh-colored silk velvet. This behemoth occupied my dining room table for 3 months, and I cried with joy when I realized that it was going to work and not fall apart when it was hung up. I think if I actually knew what I was doing when I made this coat, that I never would have even attempted it. This piece must be carried around on a carrier that I made that's sort of like a comforter, really thick, like a dead body, and to hang it without injury requires 4 strong people following a very precise ritual. Bleed is made from a pair of Victorian leather gloves, dyed, shaped, and shrunk. The gesture reminds me of Grunewald's crucified Christ. After the fact, always after the fact. I always realize these things afterwards. Many summer nights in my childhood were spent falling asleep on a porch in upstate New York. My last view before my eyes closed, the maple leaves illuminated by the street lights and kind of wafting in the wind. Summer Night Breeze dress captures this memory in hand-painted silk organza with hand-cut organza leaves stitched with veins. The dress is displayed without a form, and a fan is mounted nearby, causing the leaves to flutter. And here's an installation view from the Frost Museum in Miami, and you can see all the other clothing is still, but the dress is moving with the breeze. This is the physical memory last goodbye dress. I was embracing someone for the last time and realized that I was trying to burn the actual physical sensation in my brain as a kind of physical memory that I could relive at will. Made of washed silk, it records all the points of contact of two people engaged in a final embrace. By now, I have taught myself how to sew from patterns, although I'm still getting dressmakers to put zippers in because I want them to be perfect, and I don't think I can do it well enough. Individuation is a psychological term for defining a natural, healthy separation from one's family of origin as one matures and becomes an independent adult. Individuation dress is constructed of fragile cotton voile, repeatedly embroidered from top to bottom with the text, "I am not them, I am not them, I am not them," across the surface. The sash is lace, embroidered with the words love, guilt, encircling the waist of the dress several times before trailing onto the floor. Despite the attempt to create a new and pure sense of self, the family of origin inevitably seeps up and stains the surface, disintegrating the individuation mantra. I can't resist the urge to make clothing speak. I was married 7 years ago, finally, my mother says, and spent about 2 months of studio time making my wedding dress, flower girl dresses, and ring pillow. In addition to referencing my status as a not quite budding first-time bride, the falling trailing rose petals from my virtually invisible 20-foot train were my response to a church that decreed no real rose petals were allowed to be thrown in the ceremony. I did work depicting the ultimate taboo with regards to vulnerability in a series of crying men in various media. I was interested in the idea of painting the swollen, translucent flesh after a hard cry. I find it incredibly poetic that, during our most vulnerable moments, our insides are visible through our outsides. This painting is in oil and acrylic. Crying Man 3 is embroidered on red velvet in bas-relief. And Crying Man 1 is painted in encaustic, which is pigment suspended in wax. In 2006, I left a tenured teaching position at FIU to work in the studio full-time, and after 20 years of going solo, I also finally signed up to work with my first gallery. Around the same time, I had an overwhelming urge to do an Assumption painting. Kitschy clouds, Pooty, the earth below. I started gathering reference information and then promptly put it away, thinking, you can't pull this off. You've never done anything so over-the-top, kitschy, and religious, you can't make it work. Well, this cycle happened 2 or 3 times. I would feel like I really needed to do this painting, and I'd start looking for references, I'd do research, blah, 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 and then I would chide myself and cast the idea aside as being ridiculous. Then one day, I was in line at the supermarket, and I looked around me, and every single magazine cover featured a picture of Angelina Jolie with her children. She had 1 child or 2 children in her arms. So my Assumption painting, now titled Blessed Art Thou, became a painting about the cycle of celebrity worship, particularly as it relates to consumerism and self-esteem. So next to all the magazine images of our present-day heroes are the pages selling diet pills so that we can quell our feelings of inadequacy now that we've looked at their lives. For me, it was a challenge to try and convey the mood of the Walmart, the oppressive environment that drives someone to pick up one of these magazines. Now, of course, everyone focuses on this part of the painting, but the painting is really about these people. Blessed Art Thou was shown at the Miami Art Fair in December of 2006, but before the fair opened, it had appeared on every news network and in every major newspaper in the world. It was an exciting, then a terrifying time. Up until then, I had led a very sheltered life. I haven't watched TV for 20 years, I never read tabloids, I steer clear of the noise of pop culture. But the world that surrounded me for a few months following this painting was made up of all the things that I had deliberately distanced myself from my entire life. I was exposed to a lot of celebrity websites where commenters call each other names and write ugly things about people that they've never met. I received death threats from the good Christians, and we had to install an alarm system in our house. As the painting became public property, people latched onto it to use it for their own strange agendas. I learned about the news cycle and the connection between marketing and media. Mostly, I learned that the average American does not understand the concept of metaphor. I now file this work away as a type of performance piece, temporarily foisting me into the very system that I was trying to critique. I had a second related piece sketched up and ready to go when this piece came out, but I ultimately put it away. Perhaps the most difficult thing to deal with was the accusation by people who had never met me that after 25 years of making difficult, largely unsaleable work and avoiding commercial galleries, that I had done this piece for the publicity. After Blessed Art Thou, my new gallery guaranteed me a prominent spot in the next art fair. This is kind of unusual. Usually the pieces are chosen for the fairs after they're completed. So what does one do with this kind of an opportunity? In my mind, the only thing I could possibly do was create a painting about the vulgarity of art fairs. So I spent the next 9 months creating Requiem for Vasily and the Ineffable. The painting was made at the height of the art market boom, when many newly rich collectors were buying art not because they loved it, but for status and investment to turn a quick profit. The atmosphere of an art fair, for those of you who haven't been, is like that of a shopping mall or a sports stadium, where the magic and impact of art is lost and becomes just another commodity. The triangular canvas references Vasily Kandinsky's theory of the pyramid, with the artist as visionary at the top of the triangle, leading the rest of civilization behind him. I inverted the triangle to represent the market's disempowerment of the artist, who is shown at the bottom, alone in the studio, creating a work that may have tremendous power, but becomes just another object in a sea of objects for the VIP party for the wealthy that is the art fair. And this sort of gives you an idea of the scale. It's a very large piece. Although I have no real interest in status symbols, I did research and took great pains to make all the designer fashions, handbags, and cell phones up to the minute in style, in hopes that some people would stand in front of the work and see themselves reflected directly in the painting. At the height of the art market frenzy, in response to millionaire artists who don't make their own work, I decided to celebrate the workers' garments that I wear when I create my large, time-consuming paintings all by myself. I invested even more time into these relics by embroidering them with observations about the art world to create the Art World Truth series. This series, like many others, is ongoing, with 7 currently completed. And I actually wore this to Art Miami, I think in 2008. They were the overalls that I used to paint that painting, and then I wore them to the art fair. This is about the youth obsession in the art market, and this is actually based on a true story of a panel discussion that I went to in Miami. In the summertime, I wore dresses to paint in. few years, I have felt more free in my art making than ever before. Although the initial impetus for work might be conceptual or a desire to push materials, the challenge is always to weave both together and search for the most potent combination. While the consistency of the products may seem erratic to some, when you look at the work over the years rather than months, they make sense. I may add to a series that I began 5 years ago or make something new that is seemingly unrelated to anything I've ever done before. It's career suicide in this age of branding, but I feel confident of the threads running through the work, and thankfully most curators are willing to do the work to find those threads. Here, fiber and painting combined in a piece about circumstances of birth executed on a dirty found rug. And here in several of my Guardian Angels That Don't Come Through series. Other works in this series used custom etched mirrors on drawings suspended over graphite-coated tissue paper. I collect vintage Guardian Angel prints and recently did a very sincere mural of one on my daughter's bedroom wall, even as I was working on this series. A fairly recent body of work came about when a friend, who's here, asked me to make some pieces for a silver point show. I hadn't done silver point in a while, so I bought a beautiful prepared panel, and about a half an hour into the tornado drawing, I became bored out of my mind. So I went to the thrift store, and I was in search of old silver things to draw on, and that was the beginning of this Tempest and Deluge series. To me, emotion is internal weather, while tornadoes are signals of impending doom. Floods feel like overwhelming sorrow. The final word is a recent piece that uses hundreds of French knots in a pointillist fashion. There is a cut at the top of the black cotton velvet that has been crudely mended. I am beginning to identify a pattern in my newer projects. I read some story in the newspaper of cruelty or wild injustice, and I start to experience empathy to the point where it feels like a literal blow to my body. Some of these stories stick. I can't get rid of them. And I carry them around with me until I've gestated a way to transform them into something beautiful. The act of creation also removes the pain from my body. I believe that artists are born with extra antennae, that many of us are what psychologists call highly sensitive people, and we're actually wired differently. Psychologists are really beginning to study this more and more. I can often feel when someone in the room is angry, or I'm frequently wary of untrustworthy people who others initially see as benign. And I experience sensory overload in places like shopping malls. I mean, I feel like it's unbearable. And as I begin to articulate this phenomenon to my friends and fellow artists, I'm finding that a lot of other artists are telling me that their own process is very similar to this. So, I finally did have a daughter. She is the love of my life, and giving birth was the only thing I have ever accomplished that my mother is truly proud of. But it was a tough road. 2 weeks after I became pregnant, my husband, a scientist, was laid off from work and was unemployed for all of my pregnancy. It was the beginning of a very difficult period that we are still recovering from. Now, it's noteworthy that I have spent my entire life up to this point making work about human vulnerability and strong emotion. I was very proud of my bravery and ability to handle discomfort. I thought I was way out there, out on the trapeze without a net, holding nothing back. But it turns out that I didn't know what the hell I was talking about. All of that was nothing compared to having a child. I suddenly had the sensation of having lived in a pitch black room my entire life and opening the door to a light so bright that I thought it was going to kill me. My capacity for every possible emotion was stretched wide open the day that my daughter was born. In my opinion, it is an art hierarchy created by men that has valued detachment over strong emotion in artwork. And I will maintain until the day that I die that becoming a mother made me a much stronger artist. Heart Center employs three-dimensional embroidery along with taffeta dressmaker details on the mat. I worked on this piece early in my pregnancy when everything was tenuous and I was confined to bed. I can remember thinking of the baby as I worked. Hang on, little peanut. Hang on, little peanut. Consciously making each stitch as a way of sewing her in and keeping her. This piece is a reference to the saying that once you have a child, your heart is forever walking around outside of your body. Upon the occasion of my daughter's birth, be careful what you wish for, I became almost agoraphobic, irrationally figuring that if we never left the house, nothing bad could ever happen to her. Stay, made with her first pair of shoes and her baby blankets, addressed some of these complex feelings. Your Fragility was also made within her first 6 months of life. It is a simultaneous invocation for her safety and a confession of my own newly hyperbolized emotional vulnerability. The hair used is that which was on my head during the time that I dreamt of her, during the time that I carried her. Like rings of a tree, a length of hair embodies the passage of time, carrying a discernible record of an organism's extreme life experiences. A similar piece, The Beauty of Your Breathing, was made this past year. I worked on it while sitting next to my father in hospice, when attention to breathing took on a whole new meaning. It's now a part of my daughter's collection. The repetitive act of embroidery seems to be made for calming worry, trying to tie things down, sew them in, make them stay. Embroidery with hair possesses its own unique intensity. Each barely perceptible stitch is like a rosary bead, marking a tiny but ardent prayer whispered over and over. Now, after devoting 25 years of my life to making art exclusive of everything else, adapting to caring for a child was difficult, to say the least. Louise Bourgeois once said, "A woman has no peace as an artist until she proves over and over again that she won't be eliminated." Knowing that women artists are traditionally written off after becoming mothers, I was determined to continue working, despite difficult life circumstances that left me virtually without childcare and in a temporary apartment without a studio for a year. I stayed up late, I got up early, I worked in the corner of my bedroom on a folding table on the embroideries. I did a 8 by 6 foot drawing for a show at the Kunstraum Kreuzberg in Berlin by pinning it to the wall of the living room between the dog bed, and you can see my dog in the corner, between the dog bed and the folding table that we were using to eat off of. I covered the drawing with tissue paper when I wasn't working on it, so neither beast nor human would dribble or spill food on it. My scaffold was packed away in storage, so I stood on a folding chair to reach the high parts while my daughter watched me from below. I was unusually productive, but there were days when I did not get to make anything, which contributed to a deepening depression. I was not used to having days without concrete progress on a project. It made me feel like an imposter and a traitor. I created the Art Marks project to get me through that first year, and I made 63 tiny works. And here they are installed. When things were at their worst, I began a series of little exorcisms, relatively quick gouache paintings, extricating and embodying the negative thoughts that I had about violence in the world around me, my own personal worries, my hopelessness, and my new responsibilities, so that they would no longer plague me. Life is now getting exponentially better again, but I remain convinced that making these pieces kept me sane during a time when I could have just as easily have gone the other way. Decades of Dreaming of You features embroidery on more of this hair that I sported during the months of gestation. And the egg inside is made from one of my unraveled pillowcases from that time period. When I was very young, I terminated a pregnancy. Then, decades later, at the last possible biological moment, I had my daughter. This piece marks the epilogue to those decades. I've had held several panels on motherhood and art making, and I remember someone once saying, "Whatever you do, don't use nest imagery," so I did. The next pieces celebrate the new technique I developed of embroidering on hair when working on the nest, but also begin to address the wild woman archetype. As well as society's attempts to render older women invisible, and our refusal to go gently into that good night. This is the most recent piece, completed only last week. I'm still sleep deprived. Une femme d'un certain âge, or a woman of a certain age, is an embroidery on black cotton fabric. The embroidery is done with the gray hair of dozens of women. These working photos don't really capture it, but the hair, when cross-hatched, glimmers like metal, and it makes me really happy. One of my grateful donors wrote me a lovely poem about the dreaded invaders that she purges from her head and the sorceress who showed her that the strands are actually made of precious magical silver. So, like the others in my tribe of art makers, I continue on to listen to the whispers, make what needs to be made, and cultivate and hone what I call the beautiful gut punch. I give birth to the tactile as I'm swallowed by the virtual. I obsess over craft as our world becomes disposable. I wield emotion in its infinite messiness because it's really uncool. And I work until my hands shake and sometimes break because the world doesn't care. I'm banging my head against the wall, but the stain is beautiful. Thank you very much. Can we do questions? Or?
Yeah, thank you, Kate. That was very powerful. I appreciate the details as well, so we could really see the close-ups. If anybody has any questions for Kate, we still have time for that.
Yes.
On your Angelina Jolie, was it a certain kind of criticism, like that it was anti-religious, or was it that you were making fun, or was it a comment of the people on the bottom?
The controversy and threats over the Blessed Art Thou painting were because I guess they thought that Angelina Jolie shouldn't be depicted as the Virgin Mary because she's not pure. And how dare I take someone who had a child out of wedlock and turn her into the Virgin Mary? Irony of ironies. Anybody else? Yes?
Was there any kind of reaction from the gallery you're showing with when you showed the triangular arch?
They were very good about it. They loved it, and I think I kind of told them what I was doing. You know, it wasn't like ta-da at the end.
Were you doing some sort of performance when you were there in your overalls?
It was simply a way to kind of introduce the overalls as another piece. You know, that the ones I wore were "Are you an art lover or a trophy collector?" and I thought maybe as I walked around that, you know, people would see them and think about that. Yes. I live in D.C. I was in South Florida. I taught at FIU for 10 years, and then I moved to North Carolina, and I was there for 3 years, and then we relocated to Washington, D.C. So I've been there about 4 years now. I'm teaching at Montgomery College of Art and Design right now, 2 days a week, and then I'm in my studio. My daughter's in daycare. So I'm able to get a lot of work done now. And no, I went to the Sorbonne in Paris, and then I went to SUNY Binghamton in upstate New York, and then University of Georgia in Athens for my graduate degree. Anybody else? Yes? Mm-hmm. I've been doing a lot of reading about highly sensitive people, which supposedly may make up to 1/5 of the population. And they're people who are not only sensitive to kind of moods and emotions, but are also very easily overwhelmed by, you know, extrasensory things like going to the mall or going to a concert or something like that.
Your attention, please. The Library and Learning Resource Center will be closing in 30 minutes. If you're going to check out materials, please apply for one at this time.
But what's funny is I sort of realized what was happening in my own process, that I sort of I read these articles and they really hit me hard. Like, I was in a daze after Newtown for like 3 or 4 weeks. I could barely function, and I couldn't figure out how, I went to the supermarket that evening because I had to, and I couldn't figure out how everyone was just walking around, saying, "I'll take a pound of ham," and I just don't get it. And so I started to sort of realize that this was a process that was happening to me, and that I would hold on to these things, and I was always thinking about how I could make a piece about them so that I wouldn't be thinking about them anymore, almost. And the more I've talked about this, the more artists come up to me after a talk and say, "Oh my gosh, that's how I feel too." And so I'm continuing to do more research on this because I think it's pretty fascinating. Yes? I've got scars from surgeries and things like that. I used to be horrible about it. Like, I would work until I couldn't move my neck anymore. And I've learned over the years to get up and stretch when I remember, and I try to set things up so they work for me, ergonomically, and I just try and pay a little bit of attention. I mean, sometimes it doesn't work. You're engrossed in the thing, and before you know it, 3 hours has passed and you've been hunched over this thing. But I'm really trying to teach myself how to set things up properly at the beginning and be a little bit more aware of when I'm starting to experience pain. So that's, and stretch a lot. And, you know, I always say if I win the lottery, I'd get a massage every week, because that really does a lot. If you can afford a massage every week, that's the way to go. Anybody else? Funny you should ask. It has a very interesting history in that it was shown for 3 days at the Miami Art Fair. It was bid up in excess of the asking price. We thought it had sold to somebody in Qatar. The gallery reported to the papers that it had sold because everything was kind of on, you know, going. And then for some reason they couldn't get it into the country. And so it has not been seen since, and I had it in storage. I showed there was that gallery in Berlin, or the Kunstraum place wanted to show it, but they couldn't afford to ship it, and so they asked me, well, can you show the cartoon? Because I always make a full-size cartoon, and I, being the obsessive person that I am, said, well, I have to work on the cartoon. If you're going to have it, I have to work on it, and I basically, you know, made it into a full drawing. You know, it was just an outline when they wanted it, and I said, well, I'm not going to show it like that, and that's where I made the piece in my living room, and so that has shown in Berlin. The study's shown in Berlin, but the painting is still in storage, waiting for a curator to bring it out and put it in another context. Yes?
The triangular painting, what kind of reaction did you get at State Park?
Mostly people laughed at it. You know, in the picture, that was before the show opened, and so the guys that are looking at it are the guys who like work on the lights and things like that. And it just happened to be somebody who took the picture. But mostly, I think mostly people laughed at it, and you know, I think the overalls probably offended more people than the painting did. You know, maybe they thought it was cool. I mean, you never know how people are reading your work, and they could have put a great spin on it. I don't know. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much for coming out. I really appreciate it, and I hope I get to see some of you in the workshop tomorrow. Should be fun.
Yeah, so if anyone's interested in having Kate help you focusing on your creative voice tomorrow,
Yes.
The workshop is at 2 o'clock in the Art Studio, Building 50 across the street here, and it's free. So thank you for coming, and if you have time, fill out the survey and leave it on the chairs. We'll pick it up.
Thank you.